Historia Civilis is a history YouTuber with over 1 million subscribers. On the 30th of September 2023, he uploaded a video entitled Work. Unlike most history YouTubers, Historia Civilis, to whom I'll refer as HC for convenience, lists the sources for his video script in the video description, so you can identify where he's getting his information from. And this is one of the reasons why I enjoy his content. However, in this case, I was disappointed to discover that his sources were very limited in scope, some of them were very out of date, and his video made some claims which I couldn't find in any of his sources. I left a comment on his video describing the problems I saw with his sources, and I'll describe those problems in the first section of this video. I'm politically on the left, so I'm strongly in agreement with the general anti-capitalist message of HC's video, and I appreciate him critiquing modern work culture. Nevertheless, I think it's important for such critiques to be accurate, and given he owns a history channel, I think it's particularly important for him to be accurate about history. I think he has greatly overstated the impact of capitalists on our modern concept of time, and misrepresented the relationship between modern timekeeping and work. It would be easy to overlook this with the argument, well, any video against capitalism is doing some good, but I believe critiques of capitalism should be accurate and intellectually honest. Think of this video as a leftist content creator holding their own side to a higher standard. Historia Civilis sources. I think it's likely HC used more than just the sources he listed in his video description, but since there's no way to know what those were, I'm confining my critique to the sources he listed. These were Juliet B. Shaw's The Overworked American, The Unexpected Decline of Leisure, David Rooney's About Time, A History of Civilization in 12 Clocks, E.P. Thompson's Time, Work Discipline and Industrial Capitalism, James E. Thorold Rogers' 6 Centuries of Work and Wages, The History of English Labour, George Woodcock's The Tyranny of the Clock, the GDP per capita in England from 1740 to 1840 from the website Our World in Data, and Nominal Wages, Consumer Prices and Real Wages in the UK 1750 to 1840, again from the website Our World in Data. Juliet B. Shaw's The Overworked American, The Unexpected Decline of Leisure was published in 1991, but Shaw is not a historian, does not have good data on the medieval period, and her work was criticised strongly in scholarly reviews. See the reviews in my list of references, linked to in the video description. This work should be checked for accuracy against current commentary since it's a good 30 years old now. David Rooney's About Time, A History of Civilization in 12 Clocks, was published in 2021, so we would expect it to be up to date. However, it's a popular work, not an academic work, and very thin on footnotes, making it hard to know where Rooney is getting his information from and how reliable he is. HC has relied on this work a lot when discussing topics such as how factory owners used clocks, which they manipulated to get more work out of their employees. However, I found that when he writes on this, Rooney just cites E.P. Thompson's work. So there's no original research here, and Rooney's reliance on Thompson means if Thompson is wrong on this point, then Rooney is also wrong. E.P. Thompson's Time, Work Discipline and Industrial Capitalism is a short paper published in 1967, and it's focused entirely on early modern England, so it can't support HC's broader claims about medieval Europe. It cites some primary sources, but it cites them in a way which sometimes contradicts what HC says about the history. Thompson's paper is unsubstantiated by firm evidence and is really more theoretical than empirical. Thompson has also been criticised for his poor sources. Historian Hans Joachim Voth writes, quote, "Unfortunately, the empirical basis for these views is weak. Thompson largely relied on literary sources. As many critics have argued, these are difficult to interpret and are unrepresentative as well." End quote. James E. Thorold Rogers' 6 Centuries of Work and Wages, The History of English Labour, was published in 1884, so it definitely needs to be checked for accuracy. That's a huge amount of history to be covered by one book, using 19th century methodology and sources. It's also very limited in its scope. It only covers England. George Woodcock's The Tyranny of the Clock is a short paper published in 1944. It's an opinion piece without sources, so it definitely needs to be checked for accuracy. Woodcock was an anarchist, as I am, so we would expect him to have strong views about capitalism and labour, but he was not a professional historian. Stone Age work economies. HC starts with a description of Stone Age economies, telling us that in the 20th century, anthropologists found, quote, virtually all Stone Age people like to work an average of 4 to 6 hours per day, end quote. Adding, quote, most Stone Age people like to work in bursts, with one fast day followed by one slow day, usually something like 8 hours of work, then 2 hours of work, then 8, then 2, end quote. He doesn't cite a source for this, so I had to look for a source. The closest I could find to such a claim was a chapter entitled The Original Affluent Society in a book published in 1972, written by anthropologist Marshall Salins. Based on studies of hunter-gatherer societies in the Kalahari Desert in Africa and Arnhem Land in Australia, Salins proposed that Stone Age people worked, quote, a mean of 3 to 5 hours per adult worker per day in food production, end quote. Salins' work was highly influential in the field and is still cited today in academia, but the field has moved on greatly since 1972. I spent a long time reading through both older and more recent critiques of Salins, as well as current commentary on Stone Age economics, and I couldn't find a firm consensus on the work hours and working patterns of Paleolithic and Neolithic societies. The chapter Stone Age Economics, A New Audit by British archaeologist Graham Barker in the 2017 book Encounters, Excavations and Argosies, Essays for Richard Hodges, provides a useful survey of the subject from the initial publication of Salins' work and its influence up to the present, explaining how a considerable amount of new data has changed previous models, but doesn't offer any convenient academic consensus on the question of how much Stone Age people worked each day, or even the conditions under which they lived and worked. However, the chapter does provide a useful literature review, citing key criticisms of Salins' work over the years, as well as additional scholars and studies which have shed new light on the subject. Salins' work continues to be influential. As recently as 2000, American archaeologist Dave Kaplan wrote, quote, what has been the fate of the idea of hunter-gatherer affluence since its early pronouncement some 30 years ago? As noted above, although anthropologists have voiced reservations about the thesis, few seem to have rejected the core claims contained in its formulation, end quote. Nevertheless, certain critiques of Salins' work are repeated in the literature. Firstly, although average daily work hours were 3 to 5, maximum work time was 6 to 8 hours, depending on the society and time of year. Secondly, labour was gendered disproportionately, with men working significantly lower hours than women. Thirdly, Salins only measured food production hours, discounting domestic labour and any time spent on economically relevant activities such as tool creation and maintenance or non-food material resource collection. Salins also acknowledged that the lower work hours of Stone Age societies were a product of a quality of life considerably lower than that of modern societies. However, he insisted this was compensated for by the fact that individual needs were met, writing, quote, hunters and gatherers have, by force of circumstances, an objectively low standard of living. But taken as their objective, and given their adequate means of production, all the people's material wants can usually be easily satisfied, end quote. Nevertheless, it is doubtful that many modern people would think their lives would be considerably improved by spending 4 hours a day in food production, not counting domestic labour, while losing all the quality of life advantages of modern industrialisation. Modern workers spend more time in daily labour in order for members of society to enjoy the considerable benefits of a massively higher quality of life. Even if Stone Age people only worked 4 hours a day, people in modern society work an average of 4 to 5 hours more in order to enjoy a quality of life which Stone Age people would have associated with gods. Medieval European work economies. HC starts his section on medieval work times with the claim, quote, Stone Age peoples all over the world and agricultural workers in medieval Europe both liked to work 4 to 6 hours a day, even though each group had no knowledge or memory of each other. It seems that this is just a natural pattern that humans like, end quote. As we've seen, work time estimates of the Stone Age workday depend greatly on which activities are identified as work, and the average numbers are skewed by the gender imbalance in work activities, so the 4 to 6 hour workday is less a product of humans having a natural preference for a particular pattern, and more a byproduct of how work hours are determined and cultural factors such as gendered division of labour. HC also claims, quote, notice the length of these breaks. Medieval workers measured the day in 30-minute chunks, just like their Stone Age ancestors, end quote. But he didn't provide a source for this. Medieval time divisions during the day followed the 8 hours of prayer established by the church, for which church bells were rung. Chronologically, the hours of sunlight were divided into 9 hours, and the counting of the hours was inherited from Roman timekeeping, though only the 1st hour, 3rd hour, 6th hour, and 9th hour were marked in the church division of the day, and these were the only hours on which the church bells were rung, and consequently the workday was nominally 9 hours long. I haven't found any evidence that medieval people measured the day in 30-minute blocks, and such precision would have been difficult given that during the medieval period an hour varied in duration, since it was typically based on the activity of the sun. H.C. doesn't provide a source for his claim that medieval people preferred to work only 4 to 6 hours a day, and I couldn't find it supported by any of the sources he cited. In fact, one of his sources, Juliet Sower, contradicts this, writing, quote, "According to Oxford professor James E. Thorold Rogers, the medieval workday was not more than 8 hours, end quote. Sower was not a historian, was writing in 1991, and was relying on the work of Rogers, who wrote in the 19th century, so I don't regard this as a reliable source, but even this would be still a far longer workday than the 4 to 6 hours H.C. suggests for the medieval period. Identifying the length of the average medieval workday is difficult given considerable differences between regions as well as between different periods in the medieval era, and estimates far longer than that of Rogers are easy to find. The 2016 paper Work and the Adolescent in Medieval England, AD 900 to 1550, The Osteological Evidence, by archaeologist Mary Lewis, provides a very dismal view of the health conditions of medieval labourers, especially adolescents. Lewis describes how archaeological evidence of skeletal remains shows these child labourers suffered various forms of physical harm, as well as a range of bacterial infections and diseases. The quality of pre-modern work conditions is a topic H.C. doesn't really mention, but I think it's worth considering. Would you rather work for 8 hours seated in an air-conditioned office, or 4 to 6 hours in a field performing physically damaging labour? Lewis only makes a passing comment on the medieval workday, writing, quote, "Before the Industrial Revolution, it was likely that the working day was 5 a.m. to 8 p.m., depending on the hours of daylight, and no concession was made for the age of the apprentice," end quote. However, for this, she cites English Apprenticeship and Child Labour by Olive Jocelyn Dunlop, published in 1912, and I don't consider this a much better source for the medieval period than Rogers. The 14th century poem called Pearl records a typical workday for field labourers starting at daylight and ending at sundown. It's certain that workers were not labouring for this entire duration, as there would have been breaks for meals and rest, but there's no indication that the real working day was as little as 4 hours long. In his depiction of medieval people as largely unconcerned by the regulation of work by time, a concept he attributes to the early modern period, H.C. overlooks the fact that the medieval period saw numerous attempts to measure and periodize time. Sundials were ubiquitous, but sand glasses, water clocks, and candle clocks were also used. By the end of the 14th century, the first mechanical clocks were being built as a result of the medieval desire to measure and regulate time more reliably and with a greater degree of precision. Thus, the true origin of the artificial measuring and regulation of work hours was from the bottom up during the medieval period, not imposed from the top down by capitalists during the early modern period, as H.C.'s video implies. Early modern European work economies. H.C.'s section on early modern work economies contains a number of claims which are either unsourced or contradicted by his own sources. He claims, quote, "But by the 16th and 17th centuries, a new custom invented by workers disrupted this pattern. They called it St. Monday," end quote, which he describes as, quote, "a kind of unofficial holiday where absenteeism was permitted and even expected on the first day of the work week," end quote. Although this is broadly true, Thompson, one of H.C.'s sources, provides information making it clear that many labourers did not have any time off for St. Monday at all, citing, quote, "shoemakers, tailors, colliers, printing workers, potters, weavers, hosiery workers, cutlers, and all cockneys," end quote. Later, H.C. states, quote, "Researchers have found that Spanish farm labourers did not work for 42% of days in a year. In France, the number was more like 49%. The English usually worked more, but this wasn't because they were naturally more industrious, it's because they were historically more exploited by their aristocracy," end quote. Again, no source is provided, and it's unclear whether these were national trends or regional trends, and what time period within the early modern era they applied to. We'll look at more specific statistics shortly. H.C. again says this work pattern parallels, quote, how people worked in Stone Age societies, end quote, adding, quote, Thomson describes this work pattern as a natural human rhythm and a common preference in people across different regions, different cultures, and different times, end quote. Thomson's own words are far more nuanced than H.C.'s claim, saying, quote, the pattern persists among some self-employed artists, writers, small farmers, and perhaps also with students today, and provokes the question of whether it is not a natural human work rhythm, end quote. Nevertheless, he cites this practice as continuing well into the industrial era, contrary to what H.C. seems to believe. But now let's look in more detail at recent research into medieval workdays, using the medievalist Etienne Scolier's studies of the European Low Countries in the pre-modern era. Relying on Scolier's work, historian Peter Stable describes work hours in 16th century Belgium, observing, quote, in Brussels, the working day seems to have changed constantly throughout the year, end quote, adding, quote, there were 6 categories of working days, ranging from 7.5 hours in winter to no less than 11.5 hours in summer, end quote. He also describes stonemasons in Antwerp working, quote, between 7 and 11 hours a day, depending on the season, end quote. Although this is only one period of time and one region in early modern Europe, it's clear the workday was far longer than H.C. suggested, and there's no indication of a natural rhythm of working slow and fast. Work hours during specific seasons could be extremely long, with haymaking in 18th century Sweden recorded as taking up to 19 hours a day. German historian Hans Joachim Voth has estimated that by the mid-18th century, before the Industrial Revolution, a workday of 11 hours had become firmly established. Voth's extensive empirical survey of work records for a wide range of professions in 18th century England also indicated an average sleep time of 7.5 hours, though he notes this fell by an hour by the start of the 19th century. H.C. claims, quote, before too long, the capitalists were able to convince city governments to get involved, who began issuing fines to workers who were late for the workday bell. Let me say this again. If a worker who worked for a private business was 1 minute late for work, the local government would fine them as much as an entire day's pay, end quote. However, he doesn't provide a source for this. I looked in 2 of his sources, Thomson and Shaw, but didn't find any support for this claim. Thomson cites workers in the 18th century who were fined for lateness, but the fine was not an entire day's pay, and this was enforced by the factory, not the government. Similarly, Shaw writes, quote, fines were levied against workers who disobeyed the injunctions of the bells by coming late to work or leaving early, end quote, but doesn't provide any details. Contrary to H.C.'s claim that mechanical timekeeping was instituted by capitalists in 17th century to control their workers and punish them for lack of productivity, historian Peter Stable observes that the regulation of labour hours dates to the medieval period. He writes, quote, from their very early history, even before the craft guilds came of age, regulation of labour time was ubiquitous in most Flemish and artesian cloth manufacturing cities. Nearly everywhere, the working day was decided by the urban authorities and announced by bells. The working year was divided into working days and Sundays and religious festive days, end quote. He notes the development of time regulation, quote, was refined and intensified in the course of the second half of the 13th and early 14th century, when craft guilds pushed away the traditional relations between merchant entrepreneurs and textile workers and replaced them with the late medieval small artisanal workshops, end quote. It was during this time that mechanical clock technology developed significantly in Europe, and workdays started becoming organized and regulated according to clock time. This was long before the capitalist era. Historian Mark Halewood likewise writes of a well-established culture of timekeeping and work regulation by time, which was already present in the beginning of the early modern period, and which originated in the family home, rather than being enforced by foremen or overseers, writing, quote, we should not overlook the importance of ordered time in another, arguably the key institution of the early modern world in both urban and rural contexts, the household, end quote. He cites scholarship on the early modern period demonstrating that, quote, for early modern England's middling sort families, the working day of the household followed a clear and regular rhythm that was anything but irregular, erratic, and relaxed, end quote. Halewood adds, quote, this was, as we know, a society obsessed with order and conduct books were clear enough that this should extend to the organisation of household members' everyday work patterns in urban and rural areas alike. Time discipline began at home." End quote. In this section of his video, HC makes one of his boldest claims, stating, quote, "In 1664, some absolutely psychotic capitalist named Richard Palmer, cursed be his name, paid the church in the town of Wokingham, England, to ring their bell at precisely 4 o'clock every morning and at precisely 8 o'clock every evening. He did this because he was still seeing the cultural evidence of winter wages, where workers woke up later during the slow winter months and worked half as hard as they normally did. As a capitalist, this drove Palmer crazy. He felt that it was deeply important for workers to be up 4 hours before sunrise every day, even if they didn't really have any work to do. If they didn't want to work up on their own, he would do it for them. So he had the church bell ring at 4 o'clock every morning, 4 hours before sunrise." End quote. I couldn't find any evidence Palmer was a capitalist, let alone psychotic, either literally or metaphorically. This bell-ringing arrangement, along with some of his land, was a charitable endowment to be supplied from his estate after his death. If he was really motivated by capitalist anger at people working shorter hours than he thought they should, then he would surely have made this happen during his lifetime, not after he was dead. In his will, Palmer explained his motivation for choosing these times was, quote, "that any who might live within the sound might thereby be induced to a timely going to rest in the evening and earlier rising in the morning to the labours and duties of their several callings." End quote. So his reason for ringing the bell at 8 o'clock at night was deliberately charitable, reminding people to go to bed early so that they would have enough rest for the next day. If they followed Palmer's recommendation, they would receive a good 8 hours of sleep a night, even if they woke up to the bell at 4 a.m. the next morning. 8 hours of sleep is not what I would call inhumane. Palmer also wrote that another reason for sponsoring this arrangement was that strangers on winter nights, quote, "might be informed of the time of night and receive some guidance into their night way." End quote. None of this sounds very psychotic, and it's obviously nothing to do with capitalism. There's something else Palmer mentions which is particularly important, which is that he believed no one would object to this arrangement since it was, quote, "being done and well approved of in most of the cities and market towns, and many other places in the kingdom." End quote. So despite HC representing this arrangement as some kind of novelty, Palmer's actual motivation was charitable, the arrangement was very humane to ensure workers would receive a good 8 hours of sleep, and it wasn't even a novelty. It was standard practice in many areas. Remember, I'm getting all this information from Thomson, the source HC used himself. Given the fact that HC actually used Thomson, I have no idea why he ended up misrepresenting Palmer so badly. I wonder if he relied on another source for his interpretation of Palmer, but I can't know because HC didn't mention which source he used for this part of his video. Late modern European work economies. In this last section, I'll examine a very strong claim HC made in his description of late modern European work economies. He stated, quote, "One trick that bosses liked to pull with early company clocks was to rig them to the production line so that if there was any sort of technological problem, as there often was, then the clock would stop. Later generations of company clocks had mechanisms built into them that caused them to periodically pause during the workday, accumulating minutes, only to suddenly jump forward to the real time during breaks. But when workers talked with other workers about how the company clocks were inaccurate, it became standard practice within the textile industry to fire them on the spot." End quote. I'm guessing this comes from Woodcock, who wrote, quote, "In the early factories, the employers went so far as to manipulate their clocks or sound their factory whistles at the wrong times in order to defraud their workers a little of this valuable new commodity." End quote. That's still very far from what HC claimed. I found something like this claim repeated in an article on the website SJX Watches, a Singaporean site containing commentary on the history of watches and the watchmaking industry, which stated, quote, "Some factory workers used watches as a means to reshape power relation between employer and employee, since a worker who owned a pocket watch would be able to contest the dishonest manipulation of production floor clocks by the factory owner." End quote. As an example, this article cited the 19th century book Chapters in the Life of a Dundee Factory Boy, an autobiography, in which the author, James Miles, recorded just such an event in his own life, writing, quote, "The clocks at the factories were often put forward in the morning and back at night, and instead of being instruments for the measurement of time, they were used as cloaks for cheatery and oppression. Though this was known amongst the hands, all were afraid to speak, and a workman then was afraid to carry a watch, as it was no uncommon event to dismiss anyone who presumed to know too much about the science of horology." End quote. However, this was the only source I could find for this ever happening. I could not find any evidence from primary or secondary sources that this was a regular practice, whether in England or elsewhere. I found a few articles mentioning the idea of such clock manipulation, but hardly any cited sources, and those which did typically cited either Thomson or Miles, or both. This is particularly important because later in his video, HC enlarges this claim, asserting, quote, "This practice was so egregious and so clearly morally wrong that it became a political scandal, particularly in Britain, with genuine calls for regulation and reform," end quote, and adding, quote, "Word gets out, there are angry newspaper columns, there are debates in Parliament, there is the threat of legislation coming down on your head. It is a full-blown political scandal," end quote. Surely such a scandal on this scale would have been very well documented, and it would be commented on extensively by secondary sources. But I looked in vain for any historical evidence of this. I searched the Hansard records, the official transcripts of the British Parliament discussions dating back to at least 1802, and the closest I found was in two discussions of overwork in factories. The first was dated Friday, 16th of March 1832, in a report on child labour presented by the Tory Member of Parliament Michael Sadler, who was utterly horrified by the systematic exploitation of children by factories. Sadler was particularly outraged by the physical abuse inflicted on children when they were beaten with a whip by their overseers for real or imagined offences, and proposed that any overseer who hit a child in such a way should be punished with a month of hard labour, and the factory owner should receive the same punishment. Within this lengthy diatribe, there is a single reference to how children were fined by their employers for not arriving to work punctually. Sadler objected that not only was this completely unreasonable, given that hardly any parents of such children even owned a clock, making it extremely difficult to ensure their child rose on time, but also, quote, "In some mills, 2 descriptions of clocks are kept, and it is easy to guess, therefore, how they are occasionally managed," end quote. It is tantalizingly unclear what 2 descriptions of clocks means here, but it may be saying the factory kept an official record of the start and end of work, which was falsified, and an unofficial record, which was accurate. If this is the case, the official falsified record would be shown to inspectors checking if the factory was keeping to the legislated work hours for children. This is suggested by the fact it is the descriptions of clocks which are occasionally managed, rather than the clocks themselves being managed. But at least here, there is no explicit description of the factory clock being manipulated to fool children into working overtime. It's uncertain if the children could have read the clock in any case. What we certainly don't have here is child workers figuring out the factory clock was being manipulated by checking the time with their pocket watches. Instead, this seems to have been discovered by the government's factory inspectors. Sadler's report doesn't make any further reference to this, and the overwhelming bulk of his report is concerned with the dangers of child labour itself, so there's no evidence here of a scandal brought to light by workers which caused huge debate and legislation in Parliament. The second relevant Hansard record I found was dated Tuesday, 5th of July, 1853. This looked very promising, especially since it discussed the methods factory owners were using to compel or deceive their employees to work beyond the legally established number of hours, and how the factory owners were attempting to avoid detection by the government's inspectors, sent specifically to ensure labour regulations were being kept. I'm guessing this may be what HC is referring to. Interestingly, a number of factory owners who did obey the government's legally established working hours were complaining to the government about those factories which broke the law, since illegal work hours gave these factories a competitive advantage. I mention this simply to point out there is clear evidence that most factories seem to have been keeping to legal work hours, making the practice to which HC refers much less prevalent than he seems to think. What interested me in particular was the description of the methods used by dishonest factory owners to extract illegal time from their employees. The report in a Hansard record describes 6 times during the day when, quote, 5 minutes may be stolen, end quote, by starting the factory's machines early, such as just before the official start time, before meals, and before breaks, and turning the machines off late at the end of the day. But even this theft, the report noted, would amount to only, quote, half an hour each day, end quote. Notably, there is no mention here of thieving time from workers by manipulating the factory clock. The report notes that when inspectors have detected irregularities in the factory working day, the owners had made various excuses, quote, such as irregularity of clocks, the mistake of the engine man, end quote. Again, this sounds similar to the manipulation of clocks cited by HC, but the missing components are the manipulation of the timepieces themselves and the discovery of the manipulation by workers with pocket watches. The report observes that proving such systematic overwork was being enforced would be extremely difficult for government factory inspectors, since they would only visit the factories a couple of times a day at most, and that detection, quote, could only be so by the people working in the mill voluntarily coming forward to give evidence, end quote, but said nothing about this being detected by workers checking the time with their pocket watches. Instead of the work time being manipulated by changing the factory clock, the report indicates that, quote, the fraud is committed by starting the steam engine half an hour or a quarter of an hour before 6 in the morning and going on in the same way after 6 in the evening or after 2 o'clock on Saturdays, end quote. So the employees were deceived into overwork by starting the factory's steam engine early and running it late, and the factory owners explained any discrepancies away by claiming the foreman had made a mistake with the timing or that the factory's clocks were unreliable. This is actually the opposite of HC's claims. We don't have manipulated clocks being appealed to by the factory owners as accurate in order to convince employees to work more, nor do we have factory workers using their own pocket watches to detect the manipulation of factory time by the owners. We have employers manufacturing the starting time of the factory's machines and explaining this away by claiming the clocks are inaccurate. These two references in Hansard are the closest I could find to anything like HC's claim that there was a public outcry when factory workers with pocket watches discovered that factory clocks were being deliberately manipulated to make them work overtime, and that this led to parliamentary debates and threats of legislation. It's entirely possible I've missed a key historical source which records what HC is talking about, but I think it's more likely HC has read something like what I've already described and misunderstood it. HC further claims that the response of capitalists to this scandal breaking out was to, quote, ban pocket watches from factories, search workers before they enter the building, and fire anybody who complains about it, end quote. But again, I couldn't find any information about this. Finally, HC quotes Woodcock writing, quote, and because, without some means of exact timekeeping, industrial capitalism could never have been developed and could not continue to exploit their workers, the clock represents an element of mechanical tyranny in the lives of modern men more potent than any other exploiter or any other machine, end quote. I think that's extremely debatable given the vast majority of the industrial capitalist enterprises of the actual Industrial Revolution era and the early 20th century didn't require any precision timekeeping. Cotton and tobacco plantations and factories themselves didn't need any time measurement more precise than the sun, since their workers were typically labouring from sunup to sundown. More complex industrial labour interactions certainly relied on more precise timekeeping, but the precision of down-to-the-second measurements really wasn't necessary for most workers. Certainly, in the examples of work time manipulation we've seen documented, it's clear that simply turning the factory machines on early and off late was a far more common and effective method of coercing workers into overtime, and that factory owners were more likely to claim their clocks were unreliable and inaccurate in order to conceal this, than to manipulate the clocks themselves and claim they were reliable. Conclusion. I didn't enjoy writing this script since I like Historia Civilis, enjoy his content, and sympathise with his political views, in particular on the relationship of employees to their labour on the one hand and their employers on the other. However, my disappointment with this video motivated me to create this response, since my channel aims to uphold and encourage a high standard of research and source transparency. HC's video lacked reliable sources up-to-date sources, and explicit referencing of sources, making it difficult to trust and laborious to fact-check. Many viewers posted comments questioning the video's claims and expressing frustration with the lack of evidence provided. HC doesn't have a regular upload schedule and typically only publishes a couple of videos a year, but he has a good catalogue of much better researched and presented videos, and his last couple in particular are significantly better than his video on work. Though I'm still a little wary when he cites historical works written in the 1960s and 70s, these works are balanced by much more recent works he cites, published in the last 20 years. The work video is certainly not representative of his channel as a whole.